Good morning, everyone. Welcome. It's a pleasure to welcome you today to a discussion of governance issues in space with Kaitlyn Johnson from CSIS. Let me set a little context before we move into her presentation. Nearly a dozen years ago, the Obama administration set out the first national military strategy for space, in which it observed that the space domain had become congested, contested, and competitive. And in the intervening period, this has only become more and more true. With the steady increase in the number of actors operating in space, including the rapid growth of commercial actors in space, and with the intensifying militarization of space. At the same time, there's been a growing political recognition of the need to develop new rules of the road, or to strengthen old rules of the road and adapt them, and to strengthen the processes and institutions by which actors in space cooperate to preserve the minimum necessary measure of order there. But progress, of course, has been elusive as practical steps prove contentious among the main actors. Leading thinking on these topics is being done at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., under the auspices of the center's Aerospace Security Project. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome today that project's Deputy Director, Kaitlyn Johnson. As Deputy Director, she manages the team's strategic planning and research agenda, but she's also a research fellow in the program, with a focus on space security, military space systems, commercial space policy, and dominance. She's the author of a report released in September on issues to talk to that topic, as well as a related project report from CSIS. She has a bachelor's from Georgia in technology. Before Kaitlyn, let me remind the group that we'll take Q&A upon conclusion of her introductory remarks. And that, please give a question or comment in the chat function. Or put your handle to do this. Over to you.
To you, apologize if you happen to hear any weird noises. They are demolishing a building right next to mine, and so the noise has been off and on all through the pandemic, which has been really great working from home. But I'm here to talk to you all about a recent report that I wrote on the key issues in space governance, really. But I'm going to pair that with a report that our director Todd authored. They were pretty, they were written in tandem. They're really companion pieces on the weaponization of space, and I think both talk to one another quite well, and both really focus on not the U.S. perspective, not the Russian and China perspective, but what other efforts are there in multilateral fora, bilateral fora, or independent nations to address some of these issues. Of course, we cannot ignore the big three in space, the United States, Russia, and China, so those will always be woven into the conversation. But often they dominate that conversation, and we really wanted to see what else was going on out there. I want to start with debris mitigation and sustainability. This, of all of the issue areas we looked at, was the one with the most consensus, the one that had the most activity over the past couple of decades. And there's a somewhat developed framework of what sustainability in space looks like. It's well supported by this 25-year deorbit norm, or end-of-life disposal practices. And so this is that when a satellite's mission is over, when its lifetime is done, it has 25 years to deorbit out of the Earth's atmosphere. If it's in low Earth orbit, that's to go back into the atmosphere and burn up on its descension back into Earth. But if it's out in geostationary orbit, which is much farther away, it's to put it into a graveyard orbit. And so this is a higher orbit that just pushes it out of the way of everything else going on, and is really just an orbit of dead, defunct satellites. The next is the more recent UN sustainability guidelines. So this came out, I think, last June, and is a really in-depth report from the United Nations on international guidelines for sustainability practices. It is, technically informed. It's very deep. The effort took about 10 years before publishing, but it is well supported in the United Nations by the big three actors in space, as well as most, if not all, of the space actor, other space actors. There is an ongoing investment, that's my third bullet, on space situational awareness, knowing where objects are in space and where they're going, and a push for more inclusive space traffic management, which is exactly what it sounds like. It is making sure that satellites on orbit don't collide or have collisions on orbit, as well as keeping track of when satellites move, if they, perform rendezvous and proximity operations, so that they intentionally move out of their, prescribed orbit that they were in, maybe to complete a different mission or to get a different perspective, I guess you could say, to track that and report it. Right now in the United States, there's a push for a civil agency responsibility for SSA and STM. This was hotly debated, but seems to have settled on the Commerce Department and in the Office of Space Commerce. And there's been a strong push, I think, for the past couple of years for Commerce to take over a lot of the roles and responsibilities that are currently and were done by the Air Force, now the Space Force, tracking satellites on orbit and monitoring them. The Air Force acted for decades as the space traffic cop, letting companies, letting countries know when their satellites were perhaps likely to hit somebody else's, and then leaving that up to them. Didn't actually prescribe anyone to move, just told them the likelihood of a collision. What's also been really encouraging in the past few years on debris mitigation and sustainability are several independent initiatives that are ongoing. One that I think is particularly interesting is the Space Sustainability Rating. It's a initiative undertaken by the Media Lab at MIT, as well as several other organizations in the United States, to create a sustainability rating for companies. For me, I think of the LEED certification for buildings, for energy. And I think the ultimate goal here is to create this rating that companies or satellite programs can achieve, that will have that kind of certification that this is a well-managed plan, a well-managed satellite constellation, and it's not going to leave any debris or create any debris as well. But because space debris is indiscriminate of whatever country is trying to operate, and it's long-lasting and persistent, it is the topic that has been of most focus in the United Nations and in international conversation, and also the one with the most consensus. All the rest that I will talk about just go down from here. But it's also really built off of a lot of foundational aspects of space governance and sustainability. Within this, the rules and normative behaviors are, as I said, best developed. That 25-year rule, although developed long ago, and many are suggesting that timeline be shortened, it is pretty well followed internationally. But more leadership and cooperation is really needed as we look forward. If you follow SpaceX's Starlink satellite constellation, SpaceX launches about 60 satellites at once into low Earth orbit. And right now they have more satellites operating in space than China does. So we're really looking at industry rising as huge actors and holding a lot of responsibility as well in space. And so we need to kind of get out in front of this trend that we see coming of a massive increase of satellites in low Earth orbit. And the only way to do that is through international consensus. Nations and new space companies are looking towards SSA and STM, as I said earlier, but also new technologies like active debris removal and on-orbit servicing for new opportunities to enforce or better keep space a sustainable environment. Active debris removal is a satellite launch specifically for the purpose of cleaning up debris on orbit or defunct satellites on orbit, or even satellites that are still functioning, but perhaps they have bought this active debris removal service to deorbit that satellite at the end of its lifetime. On-orbit servicing is another opportunity that commercial companies are pursuing, but as well, I think DARPA has an on-orbit servicing program right now, and they can do things like refuel a satellite perhaps, or move it to a different orbit so that it doesn't have to waste its own fuel, and it can save that fuel for possible deorbit and at the end of its lifetime. We've heard a lot of rhetoric recently from the Space Force, the Department of Commerce, NASA, really looking to buy as a service these active debris removal and on-orbit servicing capabilities, but as well, SSA, I think, is probably the first one. There are several commercial companies. Leo Labs is one of the biggest that produce their own space situational awareness data. And for the Department of Commerce, as they look to set up their space office to provide space traffic management, they need this data from multiple sources, because it's not like GPS where you can track me exactly where I am in my home in Washington, D.C. Really, space situational awareness data is more of an opinion or an estimate of where a satellite is on orbit and where it's headed. And so the more opinions you have, the more likely you are to have better data, more accurate data. The next area I looked at was rendezvous and proximity operations. Again, this is when a satellite intentionally moves on orbit. And these are specific, these operations are instrumental for a lot of new technologies like active debris removal and on-orbit servicing. And so there's a growing push to create more operational definitions and restrictions for rendezvous and proximity operation. They need to be technically informed. Too often, I think we see a lot of policy or regulation being drafted, and then once it's put out into the world, you have the technical experts coming in saying that's not feasible. And so we need to be better and more proactive about communicating between policy and technical expertise, especially in these settings where the technical basis of the action is so important. But we also need to normalize good versus bad behavior, and this is a really key aspect that we look at the Aerospace Security Project when we look at our annual space threat assessment, where we look at what China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, India, all these other countries are doing in counter space weapons development. And rendezvous and proximity operations are really critical for certain types of counter space weapons. They are also critical for these missions that we talked about earlier, like on-orbit servicing. And so how do you define or regulate intent is a question that we're kind of facing in the situation of, is this satellite practicing for to prove technical capability of on-orbit servicing, perhaps? Or is the satellite testing its possible counter-space weapons capabilities? And so we track a lot of RPO activities on orbit to see if they're abnormal or if they've been kind of pre-announced. And so there are some proposed solutions to better define or better regulate RPO activities on orbit. One is a keep out zone. So if don't come within X amount of kilometers of my satellite. This is a strategy that they use for the International Space Station. It's very successful, but that's also an international effort with humans living on the space station. And so I think implementing it more broadly is going to be much more challenging. And the other challenge there is that as technology improves and as constellations grow and orbits become more crowded, you might have to shrink what that keep out zone is to keep up with the current pace of the space environment. Another solution is a NOTAM, or a notice to airmen. This is used obviously in the airline industry, but the same kind of thought process could be used in space, where if you are going to perform an RPO, you announce through maybe some sort of international organization, or you submit your plans, not for approval, but to let everybody know what you intend to do, where you're moving from, where you're moving to, which satellite. That way, satellites who might be in between your start point and your end point know that this movement is intentional and that it's not a defunct satellite, that it's not a counter space weapons attack or attempt to mess with your satellites. These have both been talked about, but there really has not been a lot of international movement, both in multilateral fora, but also just in bilateral fora or relationships to really push forward with RPO activities and regulating them. Last, on the governance side, I looked at insurance. A lot of space professionals will kind of throw around insurance as a possible way to enforce good behavior or to reward good behavior on orbit. And so I really wanted to take a look at, is this possible? What does the insurance landscape look like? And what I found was not promising if you're hope on orbit. And satellite insurance is not commonplace. It's mostly based off of the need to protect against the liability convention, which is that nation states are liable for any satellite launched from their nation. And so this means that the United States government is liable for SpaceX satellites, for example. And so often governments will look into requiring at least launch insurance from companies to protect against liability. But to fully build out the satellite insurance capability, there needs to be better understanding within insurance companies to assess the stability and sustainability of the environment, but as well as more understanding some of these risk factors that I have here about crowded orbits, increased debris. We are seeing a lot of normalized weapons testing. Russia actually tested a ASAT, an anti-satellite weapon this summer, and India, or late spring, and India tested one last year. And so it's all of these risk factors are actually causing insurance agencies to pull out of the space insurance market and not encouraging more to get in. And so we've seen devastating losses of insurance companies as satellites either fail to reach orbit or fail on orbit, but also several companies saying that the risk factors are too great and they can't sustain perhaps on orbit insurance, even if they will insure a launch itself. This leads me a bit into space weapons, which you've probably heard scattered throughout this because it really does touch on everything. It's a big question mark as we look towards our research. I want to say it outright that weaponization is different than militarization of space. We often hear these terms exchanged as if they mean the same thing, but space has actually been weaponized since the first satellite that was ever launched. It was a military satellite. And so the militarization of space is long past us. What we're really focusing on is the weaponization aspect. And are we seeing weapons on orbit? Are we seeing weapons on Earth that can reach orbit? Or maybe we'll get into, I guess, the categories a little bit in a little bit. But what's really important that there's little consensus on what actually defines a space weapon, especially in the international fora. And so how can we agree on regulations or best practices if we can't even define what a space weapon is? And so we hopefully are offering a framework for thinking about space weapons and their definitions based on where the weapon is hosted and where it's having its effect. And so we've split it up into Earth to space, space to space, and space to Earth, and have crosswalked that with both kinetic and non-kinetic capabilities. So kinetic causing a physical disturbance, non-kinetic does not actually have to cause a physical disturbance to affect your capabilities. These are a few examples that we have seen either talked about, like rods from God, which are tungsten rods hosted in space that drop. It's an interesting and kind of crazy idea, but also very real, very often used effects like jamming. Something that we study in our space threat assessment is the increasing use and normalization of use of jamming, especially by Russia and China. One of my favorite stories is that President Putin actually travels, there's evidence that he travels with a jamming equipment in his motorcade. And so there was this instance where he was visiting a new bridge that spanned from Russia to Crimea. And once the presidential motorcade showed up, all of the GPS for ships and boats in the area went haywire. And once the President Putin left, they returned to normal. And so for us, this is the kind of public information we track and we identify and say, hey, they're using jamming equipment, which is really a space weapon, but it's having terrestrial effect. And so as we talk about regulating for space weapons, what counts, what doesn't count? Should we lump them all together, or should we really break them apart and maybe start with the most either dangerous or the ones most likely to create debris and then work our way from there? Right now, there are no current agreements that completely limit space weapons or counter space activities within those categories of the framework I just showed you. Some limit subsets. For example, the Outer Space Treaty prohibits placing a nuclear weapon on orbit or hosting one on a celestial body. And that would be either space to space or space to Earth kinetic effect. But these agreements kind of show what has been a priority for nations in the past. There hasn't been a lot recently, however. So the two that we really consider as space weapons treaties are the Partial Test Ban Treaty and the Outer Space Treaty, as I mentioned. However, there are some more recent proposals through the UN, through UN Conference on Disarmament, and others. There are many non-binding resolutions that have been proposed. They focus on preventing an arms race, but most importantly, they get back to this issue of debris and sustainability of the environment. Since debris is indiscriminate, no matter who creates it, it's going to affect us all equally. It is really a foundational piece in space policy for building on this common concern to perhaps implement more arms control in space. So there are two main proposals right now. One is the Russian and Chinese PPWT proposal, which the US strongly disagrees with. It was first, I think, voted on in 2008 and has not gone very far since, or was announced in 2008. And then the second is the European Union Code of Conduct, which was well done, but not well received in the United Nations. And so even though it has a lot of really great work within it, it's not a top contender for arms control in space. The difference on perspectives of space weapons really hinges on a few factors. One of the easiest is nuclear versus conventional, and we have seen that with the Outer Space Treaty, stationed on Earth or stationed in space, because you can have, I guess, the same weapons effect or weapon type used on Earth versus used in space. I'm mincing my words, but maybe an example is better. So you can have jamming equipment on Earth that affects, GPS receiving or communications from satellites on Earth. You could also device on a satellite, launch it into space, and then jam satellites that yours is near from sending their signals back down to Earth, or jam the crosslinks, so the satellites talking to one another that are in the same constellation. As I said, the creation of orbital debris is one of the biggest and most widely accepted factors for working off of to define and to create regulations against space weapons. I actually recently wrote a piece about a direct ascent ASAP ban and its effect on strategic stability. And so direct ascent is a missile that launches into space and directly targets a satellite or explodes near enough one that it causes physical damage. That's the Russian test we saw this summer and the India test we saw in 2019. But so far, all of these differences of opinions and definitions and interpretations have really prevented any sort of international consensus moving forward. Russia and the United States did just restart some conversation, which is the first in quite a few years. So that's an encouraging sign, but I don't expect that it will amount to anything very quickly. And as we see more and more companies, more and more countries, both access space and rely on space, I think, at least in space policy, we're feeling a lot of that time pressure to get out in front of a lot of these new technologies or a lot of these issues that are kind of foreseen. So hopefully you've picked up on some of the common threads throughout of all of this. The first is that there really is a lack of definition or agreement on key terms that really prevents just even the foundational conversations from occurring on how to best protect the space environment, whether that's through agreements for debris mitigation, regulations for rendezvous and proximity operations, having some sort of insurance market, and even, of course, satellite weapons, trying to restrict those. And there's a big reluctance on creating binding international agreements, both from the United States, but also from Russia and China, and maybe from some of these other actors we're seeing. A lot of them have been responding more recently to create defenses on orbit, to defend their satellites, which could also be used as offensive weapons, depending on the type of system that's up there. But also a lot of movement from nations on creating their own civil and military space agencies, just like the United States. There's a lack of international norms and norms of behavior or rules of the road. And I think what's really concerning is that some of the norms that are developing right now are not positive. Not all norms are good norms. And so this norm of direct ascent ASAT tests is actually a really negative norm that we don't really want to see happening, because it can create such debris on orbit. The Chinese test in 2007 created about 3,000 pieces of debris that are still on orbit. Today, the India test in total created about 90, most deorbited, but I think there's still about 10 on orbit today, and some of them have been pushed up into the same orbital plane as the International Space Station. It's just unpredictable, and therefore probably best to rule out at least these major debris creation events, in my opinion. There's also big uncertainty surrounding the future of the space domain. Is it wholly going to be weaponized? We see a lot of rhetoric coming out of the Space Force and other nations' military forces on war fighting in the space domain. But also part of the Space Force's mission is and should be to protect U.S. interests, and that could be commercial interests as well, such as how the Navy is responsible for protecting U.S. commercial interests at sea. But I think coronavirus and the pandemic is also throwing a whole lot of uncertainty into the space domain as well. A lot of at least U.S. Innovative space companies, new space companies, have been backed by billionaires. We obviously see that with both Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, but several others as well. And this is not necessarily sustainable. And the pandemic and the financial crisis that we're facing right now has really maybe not hurt Jeff Bezos with Amazon, but has hurt other kind of angel funders or space investment companies that are funding startups as well. And lastly, I think there's a great need for an international space traffic management organization. I think providing clarity on internationally on what satellites are on orbit, where they're headed, the likelihood of impact with another satellite or piece of debris, as well as perhaps this is a great place for those notice to airmen I was talking about for rendezvous and proximity operations. We've seen this with other transport-like organizations in other domains, and so why not space? That is the end of my talk. I hope it was somewhat instructive. I'm happy to dive into anything that was remotely mentioned. But these are the two reports that I referenced, and then the last is our website where you can find all of our information, and including these reports, but also the space threat assessment I mentioned several times, and this most recent piece I wrote on direct ascent anti-satellite weapons bans. Thank you.
Kaitlyn, thank you. That was really good and interesting. Thank you.